Forget everything you thought you knew about the Money Pit. For more than 2 centuries, Oak Island has drawn treasure hunters, historians, engineers, and countless believers toward one impossible question: what was buried beneath this small island off the coast of Nova Scotia? Since 1795, the search has produced tunnels, flood systems, timber, stone structures, metal fragments, and countless theories. But every promising discovery has eventually led to another question. Until now. New material recovered from deep beneath the island is being examined by Rick and Marty Lagina's team alongside Craig Tester for something far more significant than another trace of metal. The samples are being investigated for their composition, their origin, and most importantly, their age. If the reported findings can be independently confirmed, they could point to activity on Oak Island that predates the famous Money Pit discovery by generations. And that would change the question completely. Because the mystery may no longer be simply about what was buried in the Money Pit. It may be about who put it there, when they arrived, and why they went to such extraordinary lengths to hide it. For more than 200 years, Oak Island has offered clues without answers, but this time the evidence may be pointing somewhere very different. And before we can understand what these new samples could mean, we have to go back to where the entire mystery began. The breakthrough sample, the first thing that made this discovery different, was not a theory. It was the material itself. For years, searches beneath Oak Island had produced fragments, tiny traces of metal, mineral deposits, pieces of old material, and signals that were often difficult to interpret. This time, Rick and Marty's team turned their attention toward material recovered from deep-layer boreholes. The samples were far more substantial than the microscopic traces that had fueled earlier speculation. Metallic fragments had been brought back from depths that made their presence particularly difficult to explain. And almost immediately, one question became impossible to ignore. What exactly were they? The appearance of the material was only the beginning. Visual inspection could suggest that the fragments contained silver, but appearance alone could never establish where the metal came from, how old it was, or how it reached the island. That required analysis. Rick, Marty, and Craig needed to know the elemental composition of the samples. They had to determine whether the material was naturally occurring, the result of later contamination, or something deliberately introduced into the underground structure. That distinction mattered because Oak Island has produced unusual materials before. A strange signal can be caused by metal. A metallic fragment can come from an old tool. A mineral trace can be completely natural. An object found underground does not automatically prove that someone buried treasure there. That is why the latest material attracted so much attention. If the samples could be demonstrated to contain unusually high concentrations of silver, the discovery would represent a significant change from the tiny traces found during previous searches. But one question would still remain. How old was the silver? That could separate an intriguing discovery from a genuinely important historical clue. If the material was modern, it could have entered the ground through later activity on the island. If it was centuries old, the possibilities would become much more interesting. And if its composition could be connected to a particular historical period, the mystery would become even more specific. The team therefore moved beyond simply asking what the material looked like. They needed to know where it came from. That is where metallurgical analysis becomes important. The chemical makeup of refined metal can sometimes reveal information about the ore from which it originated, the methods used to process it, and the technological traditions involved in its production. In a mystery like Oak Island, that kind of information could potentially provide something the treasure hunters have rarely possessed. A fingerprint. Not a fingerprint belonging to a person. A fingerprint belonging to a process. If the samples really do contain refined silver with a distinctive elemental composition, researchers can compare that composition against known historical materials and refining practices. And that is where the story moves beyond the physical discovery itself, because finding silver beneath Oak Island would be one thing. Determining that the silver belongs to a much earlier period would be something else entirely. And determining where that silver was produced could potentially change the entire direction of the investigation. For more than 200 years, searchers have asked what might be hidden beneath the island. Now, the material itself may be able to tell us when someone was there. But before that question can be answered, the samples have to pass a much more demanding test: their chemical signature. The 17th century fingerprint, the chemical signature, could be the most important part of the entire discovery. Because silver itself does not come with a date stamped onto it. A piece of refined metal can survive underground for centuries, but determining when it was produced requires something more precise than appearance, depth, or condition. Researchers have to look at what is actually inside it. Tiny differences in elemental composition can reveal how silver was refined, what impurities remained after processing, and whether the material resembles metal produced using techniques associated with a particular historical period. And according to the claims surrounding these samples, that is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The material is being associated with a period around the middle of the 17th century. If that dating is ultimately supported by independent analysis, it would place the silver roughly a century and a half before the famous 1795 discovery. That difference is enormous, because it would mean that whoever brought the material to Oak Island would have reached the island long before the searchers who became associated with the Money Pit story. And it raises another question. Why silver? During the 17th century, silver was one of the most important commodities in the world. It moved across oceans, through European ports, colonial territories, merchant networks, military routes, and privateering operations. Shipments could represent enormous fortunes. And some never reached their destinations. The 17th century was an age of maritime conflict, privateering, colonial expansion, and dangerous Atlantic voyages. Ships carrying valuable cargo faced storms, enemy vessels, piracy, and seizure. So the possibility of an old silver shipment reaching an island such as Oak Island creates an intriguing historical scenario. But there is a major difference between possible and proven. A chemical match does not automatically identify a specific ship. A date does not automatically identify a specific person. And silver beneath Oak Island does not by itself prove that a lost fortune was deliberately buried there. Those connections would require independent historical evidence. Still, the possibility is difficult to ignore, because if the material really does belong to the 17th century, Oak Island's timeline suddenly stretches far beyond the moment when Daniel McGinnis and the other early searchers became associated with the Money Pit. The island may have been visited, worked, or used by people whose presence was never properly recorded. And that changes the mystery. Instead of asking whether someone could have buried treasure here after 1795, Rick, Marty, and Craig would have to ask whether an earlier group had already used the island for a completely different purpose. Perhaps the silver was cargo. Perhaps it was part of a larger shipment. Perhaps it was deliberately hidden. Or perhaps the material has another explanation entirely. That uncertainty is exactly what makes the chemical evidence so important. Unlike an old legend passed down through generations, a laboratory result can be tested, challenged, repeated, and compared against known historical samples. And if those comparisons continue to point toward the 17th century, then one of Oak Island's biggest assumptions begins to collapse. The assumption that the mystery started in 1795. Because if someone placed this material underground long before the Money Pit was discovered, then the famous discovery was not the beginning of the story. It was only the moment when the modern world finally noticed that something had been hidden there. And that leads directly to the next question. Could the original discovery itself have been separated from the true construction of the underground system by more than a century? Pre-1795 fabrication, if the silver really does belong to the 17th century, then 1795 becomes more than a date in the Oak Island story. It becomes a dividing line. That was the year traditionally associated with the discovery of the mysterious depression near the old oak tree, the discovery that would eventually give rise to the Money Pit legend. But if material from the underground layers can be reliably dated to a period long before that discovery, then the people who first found the pit could not have been responsible for placing that material there. They were simply too late. And that possibility forces investigators to reconsider one of the oldest assumptions surrounding the island. For generations, skeptics have suggested that some of Oak Island's strange features could have been created by later treasure hunters, deliberately or accidentally. It is a reasonable question. The island has been searched repeatedly for more than 2 centuries. Shafts have been dug. Tunnels have been opened. Material has been moved. Structures have been damaged. New excavations have sometimes cut through older ones. With so much activity, separating original features from later disturbances is extremely difficult. But depth creates another problem. If historical material is recovered from a genuinely undisturbed layer deep beneath the island, explaining its presence becomes much harder. It would no longer be enough to say that a 19th or 20th century treasure hunter simply placed it there. The deeper and more securely documented the context becomes, the more carefully the material has to be explained. That is why the location of the samples matters almost as much as the samples themselves. A piece of old silver found loose near the surface would tell investigators very little. A piece recovered from a documented underground layer, surrounded by evidence of an older structure, would be considerably more significant. But even then, caution is essential. Archaeology does not work by finding an old object and assigning it to the first theory that fits. Researchers have to establish context. Where was it found? What surrounded it? Was the layer disturbed? Can the material be independently tested? Do separate samples produce compatible results? And can the proposed date be supported by methods appropriate to the material being examined? Only after those questions are answered can a discovery begin to challenge the established timeline. That distinction is crucial on Oak Island, because if the silver is genuinely 17th century and if the underground context is genuinely original, then the famous 1795 discovery becomes something very different. It would mark the beginning of the search for something that may already have been hidden there for generations. And that creates an even bigger mystery. Who could have reached Oak Island in the 17th century? What were they doing there? And why would they go to the extraordinary effort of placing valuable material deep underground? There is no single answer. A lost shipment could be one possibility. A deliberate hiding place could be another. A temporary storage site could offer a different explanation. And there is always the possibility that the material is connected to an entirely different historical event that has not yet been identified. But the further the evidence moves away from 1795, the harder it becomes to explain Oak Island entirely through the actions of the people who came there afterward. And this is where the physical geography of the island becomes critical, because the silver samples are not being examined in isolation. Rick, Marty, and Craig are considering them alongside another part of Oak Island that has fascinated searchers for generations. Smith's Cove, a location where underground structures, timber, stone, and water systems have repeatedly raised questions about who built them and why. And if those structures can be connected to the same period as the material recovered from the deeper layers, the mystery could become considerably harder to dismiss. Because then investigators would not be looking at one strange object. They would be looking at a system. The Smith's Cove connection, the deeper the investigation moved, the harder it became to treat the silver as an isolated discovery. Because on Oak Island, location has always been part of the mystery, and few locations matter more than Smith's Cove. For generations, searchers have been drawn to this stretch of shoreline because of the unusual structures discovered beneath it: timber, stone, drainage features, and evidence that has been interpreted as part of a system designed to control seawater underground. Those discoveries helped create one of the most enduring theories surrounding the Money Pit. The idea was simple. If someone had gone to the trouble of burying something valuable deep underground, they would also have needed a way to prevent later searchers from reaching it. A flood system would have been an ingenious solution. But proving that such a system was deliberately constructed and determining exactly when it was built has remained one of Oak Island's biggest challenges. Now, the potential significance of the deeper material comes into focus. If the metallic samples can be securely associated with an earlier period, investigators have to ask whether the underground structures found elsewhere on the island could belong to the same phase of activity. That does not automatically prove a connection, but it creates a question that cannot easily be ignored. Were the structures and the buried material part of the same design? The answer depends heavily on context. A timber found at Smith's Cove tells one story. A metallic fragment recovered deep beneath another part of the island tells another. But if separate discoveries can be shown to belong to the same period, and if their locations make structural sense together, they begin to form something more significant. A pattern. That is why the relationship between the borehole samples and Smith's Cove matters. The searchers are no longer simply looking for isolated objects. They are trying to understand how the island's underground features may have been connected. The stone structures are particularly important because they suggest deliberate construction rather than random geological formation. Heavy timber debris raises another question. Was it simply material left behind by an old excavation, or was it originally part of a larger engineered structure? And then there is the water. Water has always been one of the greatest obstacles on Oak Island. From the earliest attempts to dig into the money pit, searchers encountered flooding that repeatedly stopped them from reaching greater depths. Whether every historical account accurately described an intentionally engineered flood system remains debated. But the repeated presence of water control features has kept the theory alive for generations. If an earlier group really did construct an underground hiding place, engineering a way to protect it would make practical sense. The more valuable the material, the greater the reason to protect it. And the more difficult the underground system was to penetrate, the more deliberate the original construction may appear. But there is still a line that cannot be crossed without evidence. A sophisticated structure does not automatically prove a treasure vault. A stone-lined feature does not automatically prove a secret society. And silver does not automatically reveal who buried it. The real significance would come from the combination of evidence: metal, timber, stone, water systems, depth, and most importantly, their relationship to one another. If these separate pieces can eventually be tied together through reliable dating and archaeological context, Oak Island may be revealing something far more complicated than a single buried chest. It could represent a deliberately engineered underground site, a place designed not simply to hide something, but to make finding it extraordinarily difficult. And that possibility brings the investigation to its most important question yet. What exactly was this system built to protect? Because if the latest material really does represent a concentrated deposit of valuable silver, the objective of the search may be changing. The team would no longer simply be exploring Oak Island. They would be trying to determine whether the island contains the remains of a deliberately hidden historical cache, and that could completely rewrite the way the money pit is understood. Rewriting Oak Island history for more than 200 years, the search for the money pit has followed the same basic question: what is buried beneath Oak Island? But the evidence now raises a different possibility. Perhaps the more important question is not what is beneath the island, but when the story beneath the island actually began. If the metallic material recovered from the deeper layers can be independently confirmed as genuinely old, and if its 17th century association survives further testing, then the traditional timeline of Oak Island would have to be reconsidered. The famous 1795 discovery would no longer represent the beginning of the mystery. It would represent the beginning of the search for a mystery that may already have been centuries old. And that distinction changes everything. For generations, treasure hunters approached the island believing the answer was waiting somewhere inside the money pit. They dug deeper, They followed old maps. They searched for tunnels. They examined timber and stone. They chased metal signals. And every time one lead failed, another theory took its place. But modern investigation offers something earlier searchers never had: the ability to combine geological surveys, drilling data, material analysis, historical records, and advanced imaging into a single investigation. Instead of simply asking where to dig next, researchers can begin asking how the individual pieces fit together. And that may be the biggest change of all. The objective is no longer simply to find a legendary treasure. It is to establish what actually happened on this island. Who constructed the underground features? When were they built? What purpose did they serve? And what material was important enough to justify hiding it beneath layers of earth, stone, timber, and water? Those questions are far more difficult than simply opening a treasure chest. Because even if valuable material is eventually recovered, the discovery itself would only be the beginning. Researchers would still need to establish its origin, its age, its historical context, and the identity of the people responsible for bringing it to Oak Island. That is why the next stage of the investigation could be more important than any single object. The team needs to determine whether the strongest signals are concentrated in one specific location. If multiple readings point toward the same underground area, investigators can begin narrowing the search. Instead of drilling across large sections of the island, they can focus their efforts on the areas most strongly supported by the evidence. And that is where the story becomes particularly interesting, because every new reading can either strengthen the theory or destroy it. A concentrated signal could indicate a buried deposit. It could also be a large piece of old infrastructure. It could even be a natural geological feature producing an unusual response. That is why the investigation cannot depend on a single scan or a single sample. The evidence has to agree. And if the next round of drilling produces material consistent with the earlier samples, while additional structures appear at compatible depths, the case for a deliberate underground site becomes stronger. But if the results fail to match, the entire interpretation could change again. This is the reality of Oak Island. The closer the search gets to an answer, the more important every detail becomes. And somewhere beneath the island, the next borehole could provide the evidence that finally connects the separate pieces. Or it could reveal that they were never connected at all. Either way, the search is entering a different phase. The question is no longer simply whether something unusual exists beneath Oak Island. The question is whether the evidence can finally tell us what it was, when it was placed there, and who was responsible. After more than 2 centuries, that may be the real discovery. Not simply finding something buried underground, but finally understanding the people who buried it. And if the latest evidence continues to point toward a 17th century origin, Oak Island's history may have to be rewritten from the ground up. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is this: what if the treasure was never the real secret? What if the silver, the tunnels, the timber, and the strange structures were never meant to tell us where the treasure was? But who had the knowledge, the resources, and the reason to hide something here in the first place? After more than 200 years of searching, Oak Island may finally be giving investigators something more valuable than a chest of gold: a timeline, a physical trail, and possibly a connection to people who came to this island centuries before the Money Pit became a legend. But until that evidence is independently confirmed, one question remains unanswered. Who was here first? And what were they trying so desperately to keep hidden? Because somewhere beneath Oak Island, the final chapter may still be waiting. And this time, the island may not be hiding the treasure. It may be hiding the truth.